Okay, Professor Gomez, thank you for doing this. Obviously, we've spoken in the past before, and you've done extensive research on corruption in Malaysia. The reason I got in touch with you, and thank you for doing this at a reasonably last minute, is the fact that you've released a new book, and it's called Misgovernance, Grand Corruption in Malaysia. And I think it bears a discussion, obviously. So perhaps I can pass it over to you, Professor Gomez, and talk about why you decided to come up with this book. And I guess provide an executive summary of what you're trying to ascertain in this new.
When Anwar Ibrahim came to power, he made it very clear that the key issue that he's going to focus on is eradicating endemic corruption in Malaysia. We were quite taken up by this agenda that he had. 1 year on, very little had been done. And that's when I began work on the book. I felt that if the current Prime Minister recognizes that corruption is endemic in this country, why is it that the progress to dealing with this problem has been so slow? Now, the issue I felt that was contributing to the delay was really what do we do with the government linked companies? And my thinking at that time was, when I began the book, the reason why he's not dealing with the GLCs where corruption is situated is because the GLCs are an important tool for him to deal with the very dysfunctional, very fractured political system that we have. And the GLCs are a tool for him to help consolidate his position. That was my thinking, and that's how I began the book. And that's what became the primary aim of the book. If you read the book, you will find that the new concept that I introduce in the book is the political GLC complex. And my primary focus in the book is not dealing with what we normally refer to as petty corruption, bribery, everyday corruption. My primary focus is grand corruption. In fact, that's what I get into. Grand corruption, and that too within the political GLC complex. And that is a new way of looking at corruption, even in the literature, but also specifically in Malaysia.
The GLCs have been in existence for at least a couple of decades, Prof, and it's become a means of wealth redistribution. And of course, it's also become a vehicle for corruption. And we in Malaysia know that fairly well. What we don't understand fairly well is the extent, the cobweb, the honeycomb intricacies of the GLC ecosystem. We know the level ones, right? It's the kazanas and all that. And those are fairly well governed to some degree. But it's, as you assert in your book, it's the level fours and the level fives, which is the unlisted private entities, which nobody knows about. And that's where the real action happens. What did you mean by that?
In the book, I create a pyramid hierarchy where at the top sits the cabinet, and the cabinet controls an ecosystem, a GLC ecosystem. Now, what I do is I break up this GLC ecosystem so we know exactly what we're talking about. At the highest level of this ecosystem are the GLICs, the government-linked investment companies, the very powerful 7 institutions in this country, and that's Khazanah, EPF, PNB, LTAT, KWOP, and Tabung Haji. Now, below them also are situated publicly listed companies, and they control a huge volume of publicly listed companies. Now, the GLICs and the publicly listed companies are always in the public eye. And when Abdullah Ahmad Badawi became Prime Minister, he too said that we needed to reform the system. And he focused a lot of the GLC transformation plan on the GLICs and the publicly listed companies. But what I get into the book is those that were not reformed. And that's a different set of what we classify as GLCs. That's the statutory bodies, the foundations, the development financial institutions such as SME Bank. And then I come down to the 4th level. Here we're talking about unlisted companies. Now, it's at the level of the statutory bodies and the unlisted companies that we see a lot of corruption going on because they're not in the public eye. And these unlisted companies at level 4 also own other companies, create associate companies, and create joint ventures. By this point, the volume of companies at the lower levels are so huge, and the number of transactions that are occurring at this level is beyond the public eye. The other point that I bring up is that although we have institutions which are in the public eye, the level of interaction between the institutions at all 4 levels, 5 levels, 6 levels, is huge. The volume of equity involved, in terms of business transactions that are going on, it's also huge. Now, all this is not well known in the public eye. The point of the book is this. It is precisely because the GLC ecosystem involving those enterprises which are not in the public eye play such a big role in the economy. It's so opaque. because the system is so opaque. This allows the politicians to get away with it. I would like to stress one more point. The ecosystem that I talk about is at the federal level. There are also similar GLC ecosystems in the 13 state governments. So this is not just happening at the federal level. This is also happening at the state level. Now, here's where the problem gets really complex. In Malaysia's federal system today, we have a problem we have a situation where different parties control the 13 state governments. So, for example, UMNO may control one or two states, including, say, Pahang. PBB controls Sarawak. DAP controls Penang. PKR controls Selangor, PAS controls Kedah, Kelantan, and Terengganu. So parties, whether they're in the current ruling coalition or whether they're in the opposition, also have control over GLCs. That means there's no political will on the part of any party to reform this GLC ecosystem. So what that means is this: the volume of wastage that's happening at the federal level and at the state level is phenomenal. It also means that these politicians from all these parties have access to public funds, which they use for their political activities to try and consolidate power at the state level or at the federal level. And all this, as I said, is not known in the public eye. And that's what the book is about, to bring this into the public arena so that we can discuss it. And also we can get into what are the reforms that are required, which to my mind can be done very quickly if there's political will to do so.
Well, pro-GLC advocates might suggest that this is how Malaysia Inc. works, right? You've got public funds which then get distributed through the GLC ecosystem, but then in the execution of that work, that's where most of Malaysia gets part of the pie. They might get smaller dips of the pie, but they get a part of the pie. And therefore, because everybody is kind of like fed from the buffet, everybody's willing to let the status quo happen. And it's also, the second advantage is that it's given Malaysia a modicum of peace and harmony, although in a superficial sense, because everybody gets to eat at the buffet table and the so-called wealth disparity might not be so obvious. How would you counter those allegations that this is how Malaysia Inc. works?
This is in fact, the irony of writing this book. I'm an advocate, strongly support what you call the GLIC Inc. I think state-owned enterprises, government-linked companies of different sorts play a very important role in the economy. I think there's a role to be played by PNB, EPF. They take care of the pension or the savings of people, especially when they retire. There's an important role for KWAP. There's an important role for LTAT. These are pension funds. When you go down to the statutory bodies, FELDA did a fantastic job in terms of land redistribution. We have other institutions like FELCRA. We have SOXO. These are all very important institutions. I would even argue that the government should control certain enterprises which have been corporatized and publicly listed, and that would include Tenaga, telecoms. These are important utilities. I want the water sector to be controlled by the government. I would even argue that the bank should be controlled by the government. These are issues, of course, we need to get into, but my primary point is this. I believe that state intervention actually can bring about a lot of good. And when the state intervenes in the economy, they need, what's their primary tool? They need public enterprises, or what we call GLCs. We have seen, after the implementation of the NEP, the new economic policy, which today we generally criticize, but the new economic policy, when it was introduced, it was in a situation where poverty was very high in this country. More than 60% of the people in this country were poor. Wealth distribution was so inequitable. And by 1990, poverty had reduced appreciably, wealth had been distributed a lot more equitably, and foreign equity ownership in this country had diminished significantly. How can we say that those are bad things? Now, what happened, unfortunately, is the government began to make a shift in its policy where they began to mix policies. So, for example, they introduced privatization, and they then decided to corporatize many of these public enterprises. And these very important privatized enterprises were put in the hands of closely connected or well-connected business people. And so began the problem of cronyism, patronage, and then subsequently rent-seeking. And from there, the problem has just escalated. Now, what we have is politicians have also realized that this GLC ecosystem, which they introduced to rectify social inequities, could be abused to serve vested political interests. Those institutions have been hijacked by the politicians across the board and now are being used to serve their political and economic interests. And who's losing out? The well-being of the electorate, including the disenfranchised people that he was supposed to help. They are the ones who are losing out. I close on this point. When the NEP was introduced, the poorest states in this country at that time were Kelantan, Kedah, Terengganu. One can include Sabah and Sarawak. Today, the poorest states continue to be Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu, and Sabah. If the NEP was targeted at the Bumiputras, and these institutions were created to help lift the Bumiputras out of poverty and contribute to regional development too, why is it that the states where we find the most poverty is still the Bumiputra dominant states? It means that the policy is no longer working, and then we ask, why is it not working? And then this comes to the issue that I just mentioned. The hijacking of a policy meant for these poor, disenfranchised people is now being abused by politicians to consolidate their own political base.
We started this discussion, Prof, by you suggesting that the Anwar government has been hamstrung in its reform efforts. And definitely from an empirical point of view, very little in the way of reform has occurred. And we know it's because his government is not as unified as he would want to push through reforms. What you suggest with dismantling the GLC ecosystem seems at this point as far away as can be humanly possible. Do you agree?
No, I disagree. In fact, Anwar rose to power arguing that he would dismantle this ecosystem, which is contributing to grand corruption in this country. Of course, he has also to deal with petty corruption. Let me remind you, I made distinction between grand corruption and petty corruption. Now, every day in the news, you hear a lot of cases of people in the lower rungs of the bureaucracy, the customs department, for example, where they're exposing corruption. They're exposing corruption in the bureaucracy. Now, what that means is the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission is actually moving to try and bring about or reduce corruption in the lower rungs of the bureaucracy. And they make a big hue and cry about it when they arrest bureaucrats who are committing corruption at this level. However, the question must also be asked, if they're tackling petty corruption, why is it they're not tackling grand corruption? So it's not to say that this government has not been doing anything to tackle corruption. In fact, it's been doing quite a lot in terms of petty corruption. The reason why they're not dealing with grand corruption is what we have to get into. There are politicians in power today who have serious allegations of corruption against them. Why is it that no action has been taken against them? And let me remind you, and I'm sure you know this very well, people have been charged for corruption who are very powerful people. The best example of this of late is none other than previous Prime Minister Muhyiddin. We know that Daim Zainuddin, the late Daim Zainuddin, and his family are being investigated for wealth concentration or accumulation in an unaccountable manner. So we know that there are politicians who have been targeted for grand corruption. So what we're dealing with here today is this. The real argument I'm making here is we have a case of selective prosecution. And now corruption has become a tool that can be used to deal with people who are a threat to current power elites. That brings us now to the second point. Why is it that these institutions, such as the MACC, are not seen to be independent? We have been arguing for that. If they are independent, would the current Prime Minister Zahid still be sitting as Deputy Prime Minister? Would the charges have been dropped, against him? And what about people from the Taib Mahmud family, who are part of the current government too? Why has there been no prosecution against members of the Taib Mahmud government, even though they have been alleged to be involved in corruption of a very serious nature? So what that means is the current government knows what to do. They can do it, but they are holding back from going the extra mile. Get this done. They are being selective in what they have been doing. And that's my problem. You cannot do that. You must be fair. If you want to deal with corruption, get down to it, make the MACC independent, make sure the AG's office is independent, make sure the Whistleblowers Act, for example, is rectified so that whistleblowers will come out and expose corruption in this country, especially within the bureaucracy. All this can be done very quickly. Can be done tomorrow, if they have the will to do it. So why is he not going all the way in dealing with corruption in its entirety? Why is he being selective in the way he's tackling corruption? That's my primary argument also in the book.
Well, I think Malaysia watchers will be aware that if he does continue down that path, he will see many component members of his ruling coalition be found guilty, right? And he cannot have that. So he's caught between a rock and a hard place, because if he continues down that logical path, he's going to lose critical members of his coalition and his government falls apart, and the next bunch of people come in, and there goes any chance of reform, and we're back to status quo. So that's Malaysia's problem right now. We are existing in this sphere of this equilibrium, this la la land where nothing can happen, and that's why we are suffering from this trap, this middle income trap, this no man's land where nobody wants to invest, but it's still a cheap place to come, and we're stuck, lah, Prof. I don't see a way out because it is so endemic. To dismantle it would be political suicide.
Cool, you've made many arguments there, a number of which I'm sorry I don't buy. Now, look, if you say your agenda is to deal with corruption, deal with it. If it entails dealing with people within your government who are corrupt, I'm sorry, you cannot be selective. You have to deal with that too. I do believe he has a sufficient majority in government to go after politicians who are corrupt even within his government. And if he is serious about corruption, that should be his priority, and he should deal with it equitably across the board. If he's going to be selective, then he's not, as we see now, he is not dealing with the reforms that are required to tackle the problem. In fact, what we are seeing with is that he's using it, as I said, as a tool only to consolidate his own position. And that is not fair. That is irresponsible. That, to my mind, is abuse of power. That's the first point. Second point, your point about the implications of this on the economy. What we are discussing today is well known in the economy. It's well known among people, domestic investors as well as foreign investors. What confidence are you inspiring in investors if you're not reforming the system where corruption is so endemic? It's not a chicken and egg issue, For me, it's very clear. You go and you deal with corruption, inspire confidence that governance is now transparent and accountable, the investments will flow in. He's not doing that. Secondly, and we must stress this, we cannot talk about corruption in isolation. Let's lay it out there. The fact of the matter is, Anwar himself said, when he was in opposition, we also have to get the policies right. And the policies he talked about was this. We cannot have race-based policies. Don't racialize policies. Policies should be based on needs. And as soon as he came to power, he backtracked. And today he has introduced the Putra 35, which is a race-based policy. He is replicating the mistakes of the past. He himself knew he shouldn't do it. Now, why did he introduce such a policy? So that he can perpetuate patronage. He can continue to practice patronage, which is to my mind, a form of legitimized corruption. Because are the people who are entitled to the concessions coming out from the state given these concessions, or are they still be given in a selective manner? And I make this argument also because, let's remember this, he promised a procurement act. We know corruption occurs in the procurement process. You saw it in the book. We know through the procurement process there's no level playing field here. Market entry is subject to the state deciding who should get the contracts to come in. That's not going to inspire confidence. So let's get all this out there. Let's just clean up the system. Let's deal with policies and put out policies which we know will bring about economic growth. And then you will inspire investor confidence, and we can get out of what you called the middle income trap. So don't make I say this I'm being very serious about this point. I'm sorry, I cannot accept this argument. You fear the fall of your government if we tackle corruption in its entirety. I'm sorry, that's not an argument. That is, in fact, an admission that you're abusing corruption to perpetuate your position.
Completely agree with you, Professor. The thing is, it is what it is in some respects. And to play the other side, unfortunately, I've got to point out that last year, from an FDI perspective, Malaysia had a banner year, right? And the Anwar camp might say to you in retort, Professor, despite all your allegations of cronyism and corruption, Malaysia attracts dozens of billions of dollars in FDI, whether by default or whether by design. I'm not sure.
My argument was Malaysia, it was by default. Malaysia was very fortunate that this conflict between the United States and China reached a point where investments were now redirected into Southeast Asia. And one of the primary beneficiaries of this was Malaysia. That is a fact. Malaysia, we are also very fortunate, it's very well located, especially in the modern era when we talk, what are the key sectors that we are looking at? We are looking at semiconductors. We are looking at rare earths. And Malaysia has both in abundance. This is where they are coming to. So I feel we have been very fortunate by the turn of events that was happening globally that has benefited Malaysia. Secondly, let's remember this. Malaysia is situated in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a dynamic economic growth engine. Everyone is looking towards Southeast Asia. Malaysia is well located within Southeast Asia. So in terms of location too, we are well situated. And I think Anwar is going abroad and he is recognizing, look, for this country to grow, let's recognize that this country has always grown through massive inflows of foreign direct investments. So let's continue in that direction. But I put this question to you, Ku. What about domestic investments? Domestic investments is also important. What has been the volume of domestic investments in this country? It's been quite low, by the government's own admission. Why is it that domestic investors are not investing in this economy? Because it doesn't inspire confidence. And I do think that the government will be selective in how they practice corruption too, or patronage, because they will be careful when they bring in foreign direct investments, they leave the foreign investors alone. I am concerned about domestic investors. I am invested in them, especially the SME sector, which constitute 98.5% of the corporate sector. I want the SME sector to grow. That's the role of the GLCs and SOEs, to build up this SME sector. Are we doing that? And if by not doing that, and by allowing for a lot of foreign equity to come in, are we allowing foreigners to now gain equity ownership, presence in this economy of a huge level? Just look at the equity distribution figures that was released in the recent Malaysia plans. In 1970, when they introduced the NEP, it was over 60%. They wanted to reduce it, and they did. Equity was well redistributed in the sense both the Bumiputras and non-Bumiputras saw an increase in equity ownership, and foreign equity ownership fell from 60% to way below, in that it was about less than 20%, 15%, if I'm not mistaken. Now, today, the recent figures indicate foreign equity ownership is now approaching 50%. Non-Bumiputra equity ownership is falling. Here specifically the Chinese, Malaysians, and the equity is falling. Bumiputra equity ownership is stagnating, even possibly falling. If you look at the current figures, they have not released it yet. What does this mean? Foreigners now are coming in a big way and securing enormous presence in this economy at the expense of domestic players. Are you telling me this is good? Is this the kind of economic development pattern we are undoing what the NEP, the good of the NEP? These are serious issues, Ku, that's occurring in the country today. I would call on the government, give us now the current equity distribution ownership figures. Be open. Tell us what it is. How much equity ownership do the foreigners have in this country? What does this indicate about our economic policies? And what does this also indicate in terms of developing a dynamic enterprise base which can compete with foreign companies too? What does it say about inspiring domestic investors so they can invest in the economy, invest in R&D, take risks, because they have trust and confidence in the government? That's my message to the government.
Do you think Anwar does this to, as you say, consolidate his power, to get a better footing, to be re-elected in the coming next general election, so then only then push through reforms? Again, a glass half full approach. What do you think about that?
And what if Anwar doesn't secure such a huge victory? For how long are we going to wait? And if we continue to wait, by this time, what damage would have already occurred within this economy?
And yet, within a global context, Prof, as we were discussing offline, there is a concerted move among other countries, including the US, to have more state-owned enterprises rather than less. It's including in America with its sovereign wealth fund, including in many parts of BRICS. And of course, the biggest example is China, which has built its economy through state-owned enterprises.
That discussion we had was for me to stress this point. SOEs can play a big role in enhancing economic development, not diminishing it, not reducing it, not stifling economic growth, not even crowding out firms. It can actually contribute to rapid economic development. The best example of this, of course, is China. China, if you go back 20, 30 years, was very poor. Look at what they have achieved within the last 2-3 decades. We can see a similar thing happening in other parts of East Asia, where state-owned enterprises have been a key player in bringing about rapid economic development. The best example, of course, is Singapore. And more recently, a very good example is Vietnam. And today we are saying Vietnam is doing better than Malaysia. There's been that argument. Vietnam is an SOE-driven economy. The countries globally which are not doing well are the neoliberal type economies such as the United States and United Kingdom. And interestingly, when it was a shocking statement for Americans, when Donald Trump came to power, he told the Treasury, I'm giving you 90 days to come up with a plan to create a sovereign wealth fund, another type of SOE, a type of GLC. He wants to use the sovereign wealth fund to invest not only domestically or globally. There was a backlash against this. And in fact, a lot of Americans didn't even know what an SOE or, for that matter, a sovereign wealth fund was. It was an admission that SOEs can play a big role in an economy to bring about economic development. Now, my argument here to you is this. In Malaysia too, why don't we reform the GLC ecosystem, clean it up, and make that be a primary mover in contributing to economic development in this country, equitable economic development, as we have seen in other countries? It can be done. And there's an alternative now. We have BRICS. If you look at BRICS, the original five, when the BRICS was created, Brazil, China, India, South Africa, Russia, all of them were state-owned, enterprise-driven type economies, SOE-driven type economies. And more recently, in the recent round of including more countries into the BRICS, a majority of them are SOE-driven economies. UAE, for example, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Nigeria, Uganda, they are all SOE-driven economies. And there's something to be said here for SOE. But let me also say this. There's something else that Trump said which was very interesting. He also said corruption now is permissible. He said he's not going to use the Foreign Corruption Act against companies who commit corruption abroad because basically everyone is doing it. So he made corruption permissible. Now that's very scary. Second, in countries that have SOEs, all those countries I mentioned, there's a lot of corruption in these countries too, which makes the argument you can have development and corruption simultaneously. Now I'm not making an argument here for corruption, but I am making the argument if corruption now is being made permissible by even Donald Trump and is being practiced in these countries where SOEs are key players in the economy, what is the level of corruption globally? Is Transparency International, for example, capturing that type of corruption? No. They don't really get into the grand corruption. All this is grand corruption. So you can have corruption. It does bring about development, but it still contributes to a lot of inequities and lots of problems in the long term, which means this is not sustainable. That's the trend today. Let's be careful about this new trend, and let's be careful now. If we say corruption is permissible, what exactly are we saying in terms of the nature of economic growth and who gets access to all these concessions that are being created? Is there a level playing field? No, it's really going to distort the whole way in which the market functions.
Well,
And entrepreneurial firms may be left to the side because of what is happening.
well, you
I'll
get a
stop here.
sense. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sense in Malaysia that there's a level of inertia with the people because it's quite telling that when entities or individuals get to benefit from the largesse of the government, then mysteriously they clam up about reforms. Those who are left out of the largesse are the ones making all the noise lah. So if it's true as you suggest that corruption is part of the status quo from here on in and it's going to get worse, well then what happens next? How does it
Cool, you're mixing two issues here, Look, I don't think the Malaysian rakyat is happy with corruption. In fact, they're probably very angry with this. Now, the best example of showing how angry they were with corruption was the 2018 general election. And one of the core reasons why the UMNO government fell, why Najib fell, there's no doubt about it. It was because of grand corruption. A statement was made, and was a lot of hope for reforms that would be introduced when that government fell. Unfortunately, the Pakatan government lasted only 2 years, but even then I would argue they were not moving fast enough to deal with this issue. The second issue, as you said about people being upset with issues here, we come back to actually another type of problem. The nature of public policies. The worry that the situation today in the country is such, especially among the disenfranchised Bumiputras, if we do not have race-based policies, will we be further marginalized? Now, that is something that the government must address. They must show that even if the argument is being made, the policies are needs-based, it will inevitably reach the Bumiputras who are disenfranchised, as well as other disenfranchised Malaysians. And it's about time we moved in that direction too. So these issues must be dealt with separately. Create public policies that really address the plight of the disenfranchised. And meanwhile, let's get on with tackling corruption, because here's the point. If you tackle corruption as it stands now, do you know the volume of wastage there is there? All that money which is being saved can be used to deal with this problem of helping the disenfranchised communities of Malaysia. The solution is there. It's just that the government doesn't seem to have that political will really to go down that route.
Well, I think the biggest benefit of someone like you and the books that you've written is obviously the policy reform they can ensue as a result. And so, ever since the launch of the book, what has been the response of the government? And do you see any green shoots of interest, that political will that everybody wants but hasn't seen yet to reform?
The book was released in November. We're talking about 5 months now. I know government leaders have read the book. I know they've been given the book. I know that the other interviews that I've done about the book, it has reached them. As far as I can see, there's been no response on their part to the book. I must say I'm very disappointed because you read the book, you've seen it. The latter part of the book is devoted just to the reforms that need to be instituted. We have done the work. The reforms, I must say, it's just not my work. Much of the work that I put there is the work of NGOs and other academics, which are put together in one place in the book, specifically to target grand corruption. Secondly, the reforms that I've laid out, many of these reforms, the recommendations have already been made by NGOs to and given to the government so the government knows what needs to be done. Many of these recommendations have been in place since going back about a decade. The Political Financing Act was even a draft was written up by the Bar Council and NGOs and academics and given to the government so that they'll implement the Political Financing Act because that's a key contributor to corruption. So what's the delay? Why is it taking so long to reform the MACC and make it autonomous? Why is it so difficult to separate the office of the Attorney General and the office of the Public Prosecutor so that the office of the Public Prosecutor is independent of the executive arm of government? Because the government does not want to devolve power, because that is what will happen if we have these reforms. Power is concentrated in the office of the executive arm of government, the cabinet, and that's too important now for the ruling elite to deal with. And
Well,
therein is the problem. So ignore the book.
Well, it seems definitely simple for me to say this, but it's true. All government needs to do is look at the last portion of the book and then just copy paste and then execute. So the ball is in their court. Thank you for doing this conversation, Prof. I think Malaysia needs individuals like you who put in the time and effort and fight the good fight. As it is with us journalists who give you the space and the time to talk about this. Only time will tell, I think, Professor, whether Malaysia does what is best for them and take the medicine, however painful it shall be.
Thank you, Ku, for giving me the time and the space to express the views to you and to your audience about what's in the book. My final words are this: we cannot depend on the politicians to bring about the reforms that we talk about in the book. The real change must come from society. The pressure must come from civil society. We have to put the pressure on the politicians to bring about the change. I hope the backbenchers who hear this, they will put pressure now on the executive arm of government. The parliamentarians will put pressure on the executive arm of government to institute the reforms. They owe it to the nation to do it.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor
Thank
Terence
you.
Gomez. The book is called Misgovernance, Grand Corruption in Malaysia. And of course, the author is Professor Edmund Terence Gomez. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.